The August air in Baltimore was a wet, heavy blanket, thick with the smell of asphalt and the distant Chesapeake Bay. Inside the homicide unit of the Baltimore Police Department's Eastern District, the air conditioning fought a losing battle. Detective Elijah Eli Porter nursed a lukewarm coffee, the bitter taste a familiar companion to the mountain of paperwork on his desk. At 48, Eli had the weary eyes of a man who'd seen the city's worst for 2 decades, but the sharp, observant set of his jaw showed he wasn't done looking. He was a rock in a river of chaos, a big man with a quiet presence that could command a room without a single word. The phone on his desk shrilled, cutting through the low hum of the office. He picked it up. "Homicide, Porter!" The voice on the other end was a frantic whisper, a man trying to speak without moving his lips. "You need to check the house on Monroe Avenue, number 3288. Eli straightened, his pen pausing over a report. "Okay, sir. What am I checking for?" "The smell," the man rasped, his voice tight with fear. "It's wrong. It started faint a week ago, maybe more. Now, God, it's bad. It's not garbage, it's chemical. Sickly sweet. And something else underneath." There was a pause, a shaky breath. "I don't want my name involved. The guy who lives there, Walter, he keeps to himself, but you don't cross him. Please, just check it out." The line went dead. Eli stared at the receiver for a moment before hanging it up. An anonymous tip about a smell. It could be anything. A dead animal under the porch, a plumbing issue, a meth lab, or it could be the one thing that made the hair on his arms stand up. He grabbed his keys and jacket. The paperwork could wait. Monroe Avenue was in the Clifton neighborhood, a patchwork of proud, working-class row houses and others that were surrendering to time and neglect. Number 3218 was one of the proud ones. The brick was clean, the small square of grass was neatly trimmed, and a pot of wilting but cared-for geraniums sat on the front step. It was a picture of quiet domesticity that clashed violently with the anonymous caller's panic. Eli stood on the sidewalk for a moment, letting the humid air wash over him. He took a deep breath. Bleach. A powerful, eye-watering wave of bleach, so strong it almost masked everything else. Almost. Underneath the chemical sharpness, there was a faint, cloying sweetness that turned his stomach. The caller was right. It wasn't garbage. He walked up the concrete steps and knocked firmly on the dark green door. He waited. Faint shuffling sounds came from within, then the metallic click of a deadbolt. The door opened a few inches, and a woman's face appeared in the gap. She was a thin African-American woman in her late 50s, her face etched with exhaustion, her graying hair pulled back tightly. Her eyes, wide and dark, darted around, never quite landing on him. "Ma'am," Eli said, holding up his badge. "Detective Elijah Porter, Baltimore PD. We received a call about a strange odor coming from your property. Just a wellness check." The woman, Denise Avery, opened the door wider, but didn't move from the threshold. She clutched a threadbare cardigan around herself despite the oppressive heat. "An odor? I don't smell anything. I've been cleaning. The pipes in the basement acted up, so I used some industrial cleaner." Her voice was flat, rehearsed. "Mind if I come in for a moment, Mrs. Avery? Just to take a look, make sure everything's okay." Her eyes flickered with something that looked like panic, but it was gone as quickly as it came. "The house is a mess, officer. I wasn't expecting company." "It'll only take a minute," Eli said, his voice gentle but firm. It was a tone he'd perfected over years, one that conveyed authority without aggression. She hesitated, then finally stepped aside. The moment he crossed the threshold, the chemical smell was overwhelming. Bleach, ammonia, and some kind of floral air freshener were warring for dominance. The house wasn't a mess. It was unnervingly clean. The hardwood floors gleamed, the furniture was dusted, and there wasn't a single object out of place. It was the kind of clean that wasn't lived in. It was the kind of clean that was meant to cover something up. There were no family photos on the walls or mantelpiece, which struck him as odd, just blank, sterile walls. "As I said, a pipe burst," Denise repeated, her hands twisting the fabric of her cardigan. "Had to scrub everything down." "I see," Eli said, his gaze sweeping the room. "Is your husband home, ma'am, Mr. Walter Avery?" Her reaction was minuscule, a slight stiffening of her shoulders, but Eli saw it. "Walter? No, he's in Atlanta, visiting his cousin, left about a week ago." "Atlanta. Eli repeated, making a mental note. Did he drive or fly? Drove. He loves road trips. Said he needed to clear his head. He'll be back soon. Her voice trailed off, and she looked past Eli toward the empty street outside. Eli walked slowly through the small living room into the dining area. Everything was spotless. The kitchen beyond was the same. Counters wiped clean, sink empty. It looked like a model home, not a house shared by a married couple for what he assumed was decades. He thought about the caller's words. A week ago, maybe more. It lined up perfectly with her timeline. Too perfectly. So you've been here all alone for the past week? Eli asked, turning to face her. Yes, it's quiet, she said. Her eyes were hollow. She looked less like a woman whose husband was on a trip, and more like a ghost haunting her own home. All right, Mrs. Avery, Eli said, pulling out a business card. I appreciate your time. If you hear from your husband, would you mind having him give me a call? Just routine so we can close this out. She took the card with a trembling hand, her fingers cold as ice when they brushed against his. Of course, detective. I'll tell him. As Eli stepped back out into the suffocating Baltimore heat, the sterile chemical air of the house was replaced by the thick, humid reality of the city. He walked back to his unmarked sedan. The image of Denise Avery's terrified eyes burned into his mind. Her story was neat, tidy, and spotless, just like her house. And Eli's gut, an instinct honed by 2 decades of navigating lies, was screaming at him that beneath that pristine surface lay something rotten. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that Walter Avery was not in Atlanta. He was much, much closer. The next morning, Eli sat at his desk, staring at the meager notes from his visit to Monroe Avenue. Denise Avery's face, a mask of brittle calm, floated in his mind. Everything she said could be true. A man could decide to take a road trip. A wife could deep clean the house in his absence. A pipe could burst. But the pieces didn't fit. The fear in the anonymous caller's voice, the almost weaponized scent of bleach, and the profound, soul-deep wrongness he felt inside that house. It all added up to a lie. He started with the basics. A search for Walter Avery's vehicle, a 10-year-old Ford F-150, yielded no results from traffic cameras or license plate readers on any major highways heading south toward Atlanta. Not definitive, but a crack in the story. Next, he ran a check on any known relatives in Georgia. The Averys had no family in Atlanta. In fact, Walter's only living relative besides his wife was a sister in Philadelphia. The crack widened. Eli decided it was time to talk to the neighbors again, this time more formally. He skipped the houses on either side, wanting to avoid anyone who might immediately report back to Denise, and instead approached an older woman, Mrs. Gable, who was watering her roses 2 doors down. She was a neighborhood fixture, the kind of woman whose front porch was a watchtower. Walter Avery, she said, her brow furrowing under a wide-brimmed sun hat. Oh, yes, a difficult man, but a good one. A Union man through and through. Fought for his people down at the docks for 30 years. Stubborn as a mule. When was the last time you saw him, Mrs. Gable? Eli asked, leaning against the wrought iron fence. She thought for a moment, tapping her chin with a dirt-caked gardening glove. It must have been last Tuesday, a week ago yesterday. I remember because he was arguing with his nephew in the front yard. Not yelling, but tense. Walter had that look on his face, the one he gets when he thinks he's right and the world is wrong. His nephew? Eli's interest piqued. Do you know his name? Julian, a smart boy, dressed sharp, drives a fancy car. Not the kind you usually see on this block. He used to come around a lot, but this was different. After Julian left, Walter stood on his porch for the longest time, just staring at the street. He looked burdened. That was the last time she'd seen him. She hadn't seen the truck leave. She hadn't seen Walter at all. But she did remember something else. Later that night, she said, lowering her voice, around midnight, maybe 1 a.m, I heard a sound, a big one, a loud thump from inside their house, like a bookcase falling over or something heavy being dropped. It was loud enough to wake me up. After that, nothing. Dead silence. I haven't heard a peep from that house since. A thump in the middle of the night, on the very day Walter Avery was last seen. Eli's blood ran cold. He thanked Mrs. Gable and moved on, canvassing the rest of the block. Most people offered little. The Averys were quiet. They kept to themselves. But one more detail emerged from a young man who lived across the street. He'd seen Walter's nephew Julian visiting frequently over the past few months. He also mentioned that Walter, who used to spend his Saturdays meticulously working on his truck, hadn't touched it in weeks. It just sat there, gathering dust and pollen. The final nail in the coffin of Denise's story came from a call to Walter's sister in Philadelphia. "Walter's in Atlanta?" She cackled over the phone, the sound tinny and distant. "Honey, we don't have any family in Atlanta, not a soul." "Is that what Denise told you?" "Lord, that woman's been getting stranger and stranger these past few years." She confirmed Walter and Denise were married for 35 years. She described her brother as a man of rigid principles, a straight arrow who despised dishonesty above all else. He was a creature of habit. He called her every Sunday morning, like clockwork. He hadn't called this past Sunday. When she tried his cell, it went straight to voicemail. When she called the house, Denise had given her the same story. Walter was on a road trip, couldn't be reached. Every new piece of information was another stone laid on the path leading away from road trip and towards something far darker. Denise wasn't just lying. She was maintaining a fiction so fragile it shattered with the slightest pressure. Why? Was she protecting someone? Or was she the one who needed protection? Eli leaned back in his chair, the office now quiet as the day wound down. He pictured the scene, a tense argument with a nephew, a loud thump in the dead of night, a wife who scrubs her house with bleach and invents trips to cities where they have no family, a man of rigid habits who suddenly breaks every single one of them, and the nephew, Julian, the sharp-dressed young man in the fancy car. Eli felt a familiar shift in the gravity of the case. It was no longer a simple wellness check. It was no longer about a strange smell. It was about Walter Avery. It was about the dead silence that followed the thump. Eli knew he was standing at the edge of a deep, dark hole. Now, he just had to figure out who or what was at the bottom. The cracks in the facade had appeared. Soon, he knew, the whole wall was going to come crashing down. The next day, just as Eli was briefing his lieutenant on the Avery case, the front desk called. A man named Julian Bishop was in the lobby. He was Walter Avery's nephew, and he wanted to file a missing person report for his uncle. Eli's eyes met his lieutenant's. "Send him up," Eli said into the phone, a cold knot tightening in his stomach. The wolf was walking into the den. Julian Bishop was everything the neighbor had described and more. He was in his late 20s, tall and athletic, dressed in tailored slacks and a crisp button-down shirt that probably cost more than Eli's entire suit. He had a handsome, intelligent face, an easy smile, and an air of relaxed confidence that felt jarringly out of place in the grim, coffee-stained homicide unit. He shook Eli's hand firmly, his grip strong. "Detective Porter, thank you for seeing me," he said, his voice smooth and articulate. "I'm sorry to bother you, but I'm getting worried. I can't reach my uncle Walter." Eli led him to a small, windowless interview room. "Have a seat, Mr. Bishop. Tell me what's going on." Julian sat down, leaning forward with an expression of earnest concern. "My aunt, Denise, she keeps saying he's on a road trip to Atlanta, but it doesn't add up. He would have told me. We're very close. And his phone going straight to voicemail for a week? That's not like him. He's meticulous." Eli observed him, letting him talk. Julian's performance was flawless. He appeared to be the dutiful, worried nephew. He was offering up the same inconsistencies Eli had already uncovered, presenting them as his own discoveries. It was a clever move, positioning himself as an ally to the investigation. "Your aunt told us the same story," Eli said neutrally. "When was the last time you saw your uncle?" Julian's gaze dropped to the table, as if recalling a painful memory. "Last Tuesday. I stopped by the house. To be honest, Detective, we had a small disagreement." He looked up, his eyes meeting Eli's. "Uncle Walter. He's from a different generation, a hard man. He was a union leader for years, made some enemies. He could be stubborn, suspicious of people. Lately he'd gotten worse. A little paranoid, you know?" Eli remained silent, his expression unreadable. Misdirection. Julian was already planting seeds, suggesting Walter was a difficult man with a past full of potential suspects. He was trying to muddy the waters, to give the police a dozen other avenues to explore. He was worried about money, Julian continued, shaking his head sadly. He was proud, never wanted to admit they were struggling. I've been trying to help them out, but he saw it as charity. That's what we argued about. He was angry, told me to mind my own business. I left to let him cool off. That was the last time I saw him. It was a plausible story, painting Julian as a caring nephew, clashing with a prideful old man. But it felt hollow. There was no genuine emotion behind the well-chosen words. You mentioned enemies from his union days, Eli prompted. Anyone specific? I wouldn't know names, Julian said, shrugging helplessly. He never talked specifics, just vague threats, old grudges. You know how those things can be. He always said, you don't lead a dockers strike without breaking a few heads. I just worry someone from his past might have caught up with him. He was good, Eli had to admit. He was building an alternate narrative, a world where Walter Avery wasn't the victim of a domestic incident, but of a shadowy figure from a violent past. He was providing a convenient, unsolvable mystery for the police to chase. What about your aunt? Eli asked, shifting the focus. How has she been? Julian sighed, a perfect performance of familial exasperation. Aunt Denise? She's fragile. She worships Walter. His word is law. If he told her he was going to the moon and to tell everyone he was in Atlanta, she'd do it without question. She's not lying to you, detective. She's just repeating the story she was told. She's probably convinced herself it's true. The mind can do strange things to protect itself. He was preemptively defending Denise, but in a way that also painted her as unreliable, easily manipulated, and mentally frail. He was isolating her, making her a non-credible witness in a story he was single-handedly authoring. The interview continued for another 30 minutes, but Julian offered nothing more of substance. He provided a list of his uncle's old union contacts, a wild goose chase, Eli suspected, and promised to be available for any further questions. As he stood to leave, he paused at the door. "Detective," he said, his voice dropping to a confidential tone, "my uncle has a temper. He always has. I just hope he didn't pick a fight with the wrong person." With a final, concerned nod, he was gone. Eli sat alone in the stark room, the echo of Julian's smooth voice hanging in the air. Most people, when faced with a police interview about a missing loved one, are messy. They're scared, they cry, their stories are jumbled, their timelines confused. They are authentically human. Julian Bishop was not. He was polished, precise, and controlled. Every word he spoke felt calculated, every emotion curated. He hadn't come to the station to find his missing uncle. He had come to control the narrative. And that, more than anything, told Eli that Julian Bishop wasn't just a part of the story. He was at the very center of it. The polished, concerned nephew was the most dangerous kind of suspect, the one who believed he was smarter than everyone else in the room. With Julian Bishop now a glowing red dot on his radar, Eli turned his full attention back to the woman at the heart of the mystery, Denise Avery. If Julian was the architect of this deception, Denise was its gatekeeper. Understanding her was the key to unlocking the truth of what happened inside that house on Monroe Avenue. Eli drove to the hospital where Denise worked as a custodian on the evening shift. It was a sprawling, sterile complex, a world away from her quiet brick row house. He wanted to speak to her colleagues, to get a sense of the woman she was outside of her home, away from the influence of her husband and nephew. Her supervisor, a tired-looking woman named Maria, led him to a small, cluttered break room in the hospital's basement. "Denise? She's one of my best," Maria said, pouring Eli a cup of acrid, burnt coffee. "Never late, never complains. Just puts her head down and works. Quietest woman I've ever met." "Has her behavior changed at all recently, in the last week or two?" Eli asked. Maria paused, her coffee cup halfway to her lips. She frowned. "Now that you mention it, yes, a little. She's always been quiet, but lately she's been jumpy, distracted. I've caught her talking to herself a couple of times, just whispering. I figured she was just tired." Another custodian, a burly man named Gus, overheard them and chimed in. "It's the lunches," he said, wiping his hands on a rag. "That's the weirdest part. For the last week, every day, she brings 2 lunch boxes. She sets them both out on the table, opens them up, and then just eats her own. Leaves the other one sitting there. I asked her about it yesterday. She said the other one was for Walter, that he likes his sandwich a certain way. Gus shook his head. I thought her husband was out of town. Eli felt a chill despite the stuffy heat of the basement. Denise wasn't just telling a lie. She was living it. She was performing a daily ritual of normalcy, a desperate pantomime of a life that no longer existed. It was a sign of a mind under immense strain, either from guilt, fear, or a complete break from reality. The next step was surveillance. Eli assigned a uniformed officer in an unmarked car to watch the house. The reports that came back were both mundane and deeply unsettling. Denise left for work at the same time every evening. She came home at the same time every morning. She made one trip to the grocery store, where she bought groceries for 2 people, steak, potatoes, a 6-pack of Walter's favorite beer, milk, and eggs. She was seen talking on her disconnected landline phone, nodding and speaking into the receiver as if in conversation. She was maintaining the illusion, even when she thought no one was watching. This wasn't the behavior of a cold, calculating killer. This was the behavior of a woman trapped in a psychological prison. Was she a victim, coerced into this charade by the smooth-talking Julian? Or was she a willing participant, driven by a motive Eli hadn't yet uncovered? The motive arrived in a manila envelope from the department's financial crimes unit. At Eli's request, they had looked into the Avery's finances. A search of recent insurance policies revealed a bombshell. 3 months ago, a new life insurance policy had been taken out on Walter Avery. The payout was for $500,000. The sole beneficiary was his wife, Denise Avery. Eli stared at the document, the black ink stark against the white page. This changed everything. It provided a simple, brutal, and classic motive: murder for money. The quiet, fragile wife was suddenly the prime suspect. The image of Denise meticulously buying groceries for her dead husband shifted. Was it a sign of a fractured mind, or was it the act of a cunning killer trying to create the illusion of normalcy to delay the discovery of her crime for as long as possible? His lieutenant, Captain Miller, a veteran cop with a cynical worldview, saw it in black and white. "There it is, Eli," he said, pointing at the policy. $500,000. She kills him, cleans up the mess, and plays the grieving widow after he disappears on his road trip. It's an old story. The nephew is probably just a distraction. Eli wasn't so sure. The racism he'd faced his whole life, both on the streets and subtly within the department, had taught him to look past the easy answers. It was always easier to blame the quiet, working-class black woman than to unravel a more complex conspiracy. Miller saw a simple, greedy wife. Eli saw a woman acting under a level of duress he couldn't yet comprehend. The insurance policy was a powerful motive, but it didn't explain Julian. It didn't explain the precision of the lies, the attempt to misdirect the investigation, or the cold, calculated performance he'd seen in the interview room. That night, Eli drove past the house on Monroe Avenue himself. The lights were on in the living room. Through the window, he could see the faint blue flicker of a television. He could almost imagine the scene inside. A woman sitting alone in a sterile, silent house. The TV playing to an empty chair where her husband used to sit. She was a ghost in her own life, a shadow puppet whose strings were being pulled by someone else. The insurance policy made her a suspect, but Eli's gut told him she was also a victim. The question was, a victim of what? Of her own greed? Or of a nephew whose polished exterior hid a monster? The answer, he knew, was buried somewhere in the suffocating silence of that house, and he was getting closer to digging it up. The $500,000 life insurance policy sat on Eli's desk like a coiled snake. It was the perfect motive, clean and simple, and Captain Miller was pushing him to bring Denise Avery in for questioning based on it. But for Eli, it felt too easy, too neat. It was a narrative that fit a stereotype, and his entire career had been a fight against accepting the easy narrative. The story of Walter Avery's disappearance felt less like a straight line and more like a tangled knot. The insurance policy was a major thread, but Julian Bishop was another, and Eli couldn't shake the feeling that Julian's thread was the one that would unravel the whole thing. He decided to dig deeper into the one part of Julian's story that felt genuine: the Avery's financial struggles. He subpoenaed the last 5 years of their bank records. What he found painted a bleak picture of working-class life on the edge. Walter's pension from the dock workers' union and Denise's modest paycheck from the hospital barely covered their expenses. They had a second mortgage on the house, 2 maxed-out credit cards, and a car loan they were consistently late on. They were drowning in debt, living paycheck to paycheck, a single unexpected bill away from disaster. This, on the surface, reinforced the insurance motive. $500,000 would be a life-altering sum for Denise. It would solve all her problems, and then some. Miller saw the case as all but closed. They were broke, Eli. She saw a way out. Bring her in. But Eli kept digging, scrolling through years of transactions, of small debits for groceries and gas, and larger ones for mortgage payments and credit card bills. He was looking for anything out of the ordinary, any anomaly that didn't fit the pattern of slow financial decline. And then he found it. Starting about 8 months ago, a new pattern of withdrawals began. Every 2 weeks, like clockwork, a cash withdrawal of $1,500 was made from their checking account. It was a huge sum for them, nearly half of their monthly income. There were no corresponding large deposits, no hidden source of cash. They were pulling money they didn't have, plunging their account into the negative, incurring overdraft fees, and then depositing just enough from their paychecks to bring it back into the black before the cycle repeated. They were bleeding money. But where was it going? Eli cross-referenced the dates and times of the withdrawals. They were always made on a Friday afternoon from the same ATM, one located in a part of town the Averys had no reason to visit. It was a significant risk, pulling out that much cash regularly. It smelled of desperation. Blackmail? A gambling debt? He pulled Julian Bishop's financial records next. As a freelance software developer, Julian's income was inconsistent but substantial. He lived in a new expensive apartment downtown, drove a late-model BMW, and his credit card statements were filled with charges for high-end restaurants and designer clothes. He was living a life his aunt and uncle could only dream of. He certainly didn't need their help. Eli put the 2 sets of bank statements side by side, his eyes scanning the columns of dates and numbers, his heart hammered in his chest. He felt a surge of adrenaline, the electric thrill of a detective connecting 2 seemingly unrelated dots. He traced the timeline. The day after every single $1,500 cash withdrawal from the Averys' account, there was a corresponding cash deposit into Julian Bishop's account. The amounts weren't exact. Sometimes it was $200, sometimes $1,450s. But the pattern was undeniable, repeating over and over for 8 months. It made no sense. It was the complete opposite of Julian's story. He hadn't been offering them money, he had been taking it. A proud, struggling couple was systematically draining their own meager finances to give cash to their successful, high-flying nephew. Eli leaned back, the pieces of the puzzle rearranging themselves in his mind into a new, terrifying picture. This wasn't about charity. This wasn't a family dispute over pride. This was something parasitic. Julian had his hooks in them, deep. What could possibly give him that much power over them? What secret was so terrible that Walter, a man described as stubborn and principled, would bankrupt himself to protect it? The insurance policy suddenly looked very different. What if it wasn't taken out by Denise for her own gain? What if she was forced to sign the papers? What if the $500,000 payout was never intended for her at all, but for the nephew who was already bleeding them dry? The motive had shifted. It was no longer a simple case of a wife wanting to escape debt. It was a story of exploitation, of a predator preying on his own family. Julian wasn't just a liar, he was a blackmailer, a parasite. And parasites, when threatened with the loss of their host, often become killers. Eli finally had the leverage he needed. He had a secret that Julian didn't know he knew. He looked at the phone on his desk. He wasn't going to call Denise Avery. He was going to a judge. He was going to get a warrant to search every inch of that house on Monroe Avenue. The money trail had given him a map, and he was sure it led straight to a grave. Armed with the damning financial records, the conflicting stories, and the report of the thump in the night, Eli had no trouble convincing a judge to sign a search warrant. The document felt heavy in his hand, a key that would finally unlock the secrets of 3218 Monroe Avenue. He assembled a small team, including forensics, and briefed them in the parking lot of a nearby convenience store. We're looking for any sign of a struggle, any biological evidence, and anything that indicates a person may be concealed on the property, he said, his voice grim. The owner, Denise Avery, will be present. She's to be considered a person of interest, but treat her with respect. She's either a killer or a victim, and I'm not sure which is worse. They pulled up to the house just after sunrise. The street was quiet. When Eli knocked on the door, warrant in hand, Denise answered just as she had before, looking pale and exhausted. When she saw the official document and the team of officers behind Eli, the color drained completely from her face. She didn't protest. She didn't speak. She simply stepped aside, a silent, defeated ghost, and let them in. The house was just as Eli remembered, sterile, silent, and reeking of bleach. The forensics team got to work immediately, their methodical search a stark contrast to the emotional chaos simmering just beneath the surface. They dusted for prints, sprayed luminol on the floors and walls looking for traces of blood, and collected fibers from the furniture. Eli shadowed them, his eyes missing nothing. The living room, kitchen, and upstairs bedrooms yielded nothing. Every surface had been scrubbed clean, bleached into submission. There was no blood, no sign of a fight. It was as if no one had ever lived there at all. Captain Miller, who had decided to show up to oversee the search, pulled Eli aside. "We're finding nothing, Eli," he said, his voice laced with impatience and a hint of, "I told you so. She's had over a week to clean. If something happened here, the evidence is long gone. Maybe you were wrong about the house." Eli's jaw tightened. Miller's skepticism felt personal, a subtle questioning of his instincts that Eli had dealt with from white superiors his entire career. "The answer is here, Captain. I can feel it. We haven't checked the basement." The basement door was at the end of a narrow hallway. It was locked. One of the officers jimmied it open in seconds. A wave of musty, damp air, thick with the smell of chlorine and cold earth, washed over them. Eli flicked on his flashlight, its beam cutting through the darkness. The stone steps were steep and narrow. The basement was surprisingly organized. Tools were hung neatly on a pegboard. Storage boxes were stacked in orderly piles, and the concrete floor was swept clean. But the smell of bleach was stronger here than anywhere else in the house, so overpowering it made their eyes water. It was a desperate, frantic attempt to erase something. The team searched for an hour, but again, found nothing. No disturbed earth, no hidden compartments, no biological matter. Miller was getting ready to call it. "All right, Eli, we gave it a shot. There's nothing here." But Eli couldn't let it go. He stood in the center of the basement, his flashlight beam playing over the stone foundation walls. One section, in the far corner behind an old water heater, looked different. The mortar was a lighter shade of gray, and the surface was slightly rougher, as if it had been recently replastered. It was a section about 6 feet long and 4 feet high. "What's this?" Eli asked, running his hand over the rough surface. Miller shone his own light on it. "Looks like some patchwork. Old house, foundation settles. It's normal." "It's too new," Eli insisted. "The rest of this foundation is 100 years old. This looks like it was done last week." His heart was pounding. He knew. He was standing right in front of it. Miller sighed, the sound echoing in the stone room. "You want my guys to take a sledgehammer to the wall based on a hunch, Eli? The DA will have my head if we find nothing but bricks." This was the moment. The moment where his career, his credibility, and the entire case rested on an instinct he couldn't prove. He thought of Walter Avery, the stubborn Union man. He thought of Denise, a prisoner in her own home. He thought of Julian's smug, confident smile. "Get the dog," Eli said, his voice low and firm. Miller raised an eyebrow. "The K-9 unit? For a search warrant?" "Get the dog," Eli repeated, his eyes locked on the wall. "If the cadaver dog doesn't hit on it, I'll sign the report myself saying the search was negative. We walk away." It was a challenge, and Miller knew it. After a tense silence, he grunted and keyed his radio. "Dispatch, send me a K-9 unit to this address. Cadaver certified." 20 minutes later, Officer Kelly and her partner, Zeus, a large, intelligent-looking German shepherd, arrived. Zeus was the best in the unit, with a nose that could find a needle in a haystack. Kelly led the dog down the basement steps. Zeus trotted calmly at first, sniffing the air. He made a slow circuit of the room, his tail held low, a picture of canine concentration. He passed the stacks of boxes, the tool bench, the old furnace. Then he reached the corner with the new wall. He stopped dead. His head went up, his nose twitching furiously. A low whine started deep in his throat. He took a few steps closer, And then it happened. Zeus erupted. He began barking, a deep, frantic, ferocious sound that bounced off the stone walls. He lunged at the wall, scratching at the plaster with his claws, throwing himself against it again and again. Officer Kelly pulled on his leash. "Zeus, heel, easy!" But the dog was inconsolable. He had his signal. Everyone in the basement stood frozen. The silence was broken only by Zeus's frantic barking and scratching. Eli looked at Captain Miller. The captain's face was pale. "Get the sledgehammers?" Miller said, his voice a hoarse whisper. The first blow of the sledgehammer against the freshly plastered wall was a deafening crack that echoed the breaking of the case itself. Two uniformed officers took turns, their swings powerful and rhythmic, sending clouds of plaster dust and mortar into the air. The chemical smell of bleach was instantly overwhelmed by the thick, musty odor of old stone and something else, something foul and deeply organic that had been sealed away. Eli stood back with Denise, who had been brought down to the basement to witness the search. She watched the proceedings with a terrifyingly blank expression, her body rigid, her eyes fixed on the crumbling wall, as if it were a movie screen showing a film she'd seen 100 times before. With a final shattering blow, a large section of the cinder blocks gave way, revealing a dark cavity within. The officers stopped, panting, and a collective, horrified silence fell over the basement. The smell that billowed out from the opening was overwhelming, an unholy trinity of decomposition, lime, and bleach. Eli shone his high-powered flashlight into the darkness. The beam landed on something wrapped in thick black industrial plastic, the kind used for construction. It was a large, irregular bundle, roughly the shape of a human body, bound tightly with silver duct tape. A wave of revulsion and grim satisfaction washed over him. He had been right. This was Walter Avery's tomb. The forensics team, now clad in full hazmat gear, took over. They carefully documented the scene before beginning the painstaking process of extracting the body. As they worked, they uncovered more of the killer's methodical, almost ritualistic efforts to conceal the crime. The cavity had been lined with bags of quicklime, a caustic substance used to accelerate decomposition and mask the odor. The body itself was wrapped in layer after layer of plastic sheeting, a desperate attempt to contain the evidence of what had been done. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was a calculated, cold-blooded execution and cover-up. Denise Avery didn't flinch. She didn't cry or scream. As the team finally maneuvered the heavy wrapped bundle out of the wall and onto a gurney, she simply swayed on her feet, a faint, almost inaudible sigh escaping her lips. It wasn't a sound of grief or shock, but of release, as if a terrible weight she had been forced to carry had finally been lifted. Eli stepped in front of her, blocking her view of her husband's remains. "Denise," he said softly, but his voice carried the full weight of the law. "Denise Avery, I am placing you under arrest for the murder of Walter Avery. You have the right to remain silent. You have the right to an attorney." He read her the full Miranda rights, the familiar words sounding alien and brutal in the context of the grisly scene. She didn't seem to hear him. Her eyes, which had been fixed on the wall, were now unfocused, staring through him into some distant, private horror. Her hands, which had been clenched at her sides, went limp. Her entire body seemed to collapse inward, the last vestiges of her strength giving out. She was no longer a gatekeeper, no longer a performer in a macabre play. She was just a broken woman. As two officers gently but firmly handcuffed her and led her up the basement stairs, she began to mumble, her voice a dry, rasping whisper. "He just needs to rest," she said to no one in particular. "He works so hard, so tired. He needs to rest in the quiet." The words chilled Eli to the bone. It wasn't a confession. It was a delusion. She had retreated so far into the fiction created for her that the lines between reality and nightmare had completely dissolved. In her shattered mind, she hadn't buried a body. She had put her tired husband to bed in a quiet place. Back in the basement, the forensics team made another discovery. Tucked into a corner of the cavity behind the body was a small sealed plastic bag containing a set of work clothes, a man's shirt and pants, and a pair of heavy work boots. They were covered in plaster dust and what looked like a few faint dark stains. It was the killer's cleanup kit, the clothes they wore while building the tomb. They had sealed the evidence in with the body, confident it would never be found. It was a final, arrogant act of a killer who believed they had committed the perfect crime. Eli watched as the gurney carrying Walter Avery's body was wheeled up the stairs and out into the waiting coroner's van. The silence on Monroe Avenue had finally been broken, replaced by the crackle of police radios and the murmur of stunned neighbors who had gathered on the sidewalk. But as Eli looked back at the gaping hole in the basement wall, he knew the case was far from over. Denise was in custody, but he was more certain than ever that she was not the one who had swung the hammer or wrapped that body. The architect of this horror was still out there, moving freely, his hands clean, his face a mask of polite concern. The tomb had been opened, but the real monster had not yet been unmasked. The Baltimore City morgue was a place of cold, clinical finality. The air was sterile, chilled, and quiet, a stark contrast to the chaotic world of the living. Eli stood in the observation room, separated by a sheet of glass from the autopsy theater, where the medical examiner, Dr. Lena Hansen, was beginning her work on the body of Walter Avery. The layers of plastic and duct tape had been carefully removed, revealing the victim. Walter had been a big man, broad-shouldered and solid, but death had diminished him. Eli had seen hundreds of bodies in his career, victims of gunshots, stabbings, and blunt force trauma. He was prepared for the gruesome, but what Dr. Hansen found was something else entirely. There were no obvious signs of violence, no bullet wounds, no broken bones, no marks of strangulation. To the untrained eye, Walter Avery could have died in his sleep. "There's no overt cause of death, Eli," Dr. Hansen's voice crackled through the intercom. She was a small, precise woman whose calm demeanor belied a razor-sharp mind. "No physical trauma whatsoever. But look at this." She pointed to Walter's skin. "There's a slight jaundice to his complexion and significant petechial hemorrhaging in the eyes. His liver is enlarged and discolored. Preliminarily, this looks like a systemic failure. It looks like poison." The word hung in the air. Poison. It fit the narrative. A quiet, clean murder with no messy struggle. It was intimate and cowardly. "Can you identify it?" Eli asked. "Not easily," she replied. "Standard toxicology panels are coming back negative for all the usual suspects. Opioids, arsenic, cyanide, barbiturates. Whatever this is, it's sophisticated. I'm seeing widespread cellular damage, particularly to the nervous system and kidneys. It suggests a compound designed to mimic a natural, catastrophic illness, a heart attack, a stroke, liver failure. It's a ghost, Eli, a poison designed to not look like poison." She explained she would have to send tissue and blood samples to a specialized toxicology lab in Quantico, one of the few in the country equipped to test for exotic, custom-synthesized compounds. It would take days, maybe even a week, to get results. As Eli left the morgue, the word custom-synthesized echoed in his head. This wasn't something you could buy online or cook up in a bathtub. This required advanced knowledge of chemistry, access to specific precursors, and a laboratory. The image of Denise Avery, the quiet hospital custodian, mixing complex chemicals, was ludicrous. The image of Julian Bishop, however, snapped into sharp focus. The smart, well-dressed young man. Eli hit the phones as soon as he got back to his desk. He ran a new, deeper background check on Julian. He had a Bachelor of Science degree from Johns Hopkins University, one of the top programs in the country. His major, organic chemistry. The pieces clicked into place with an audible snap. The motive wasn't just blackmail, it was self-preservation. Julian was running a sophisticated illegal operation. His uncle, the stubborn, principled Walter, must have discovered it. Walter, a man who despised dishonesty, would have given him an ultimatum. Shut it down and turn yourself in, or I'll do it for you. And Julian, faced with the destruction of his lucrative criminal enterprise, responded not with surrender, but with science. He had used his own formidable intellect to craft a weapon perfectly suited to his needs, a silent, untraceable poison that would eliminate the threat without leaving a trace. The clothing found in the wall with the body came back from the lab. The dark stains were confirmed to be Walter's blood, but only in trace amounts, likely from a nosebleed or a minor cut, not a violent struggle. The plaster dust matched the new mortar on the wall. But the most important discovery was the DNA found on the inside collar of the shirt. It didn't belong to Walter Avery. The lab was running it against the national database, but Eli already knew whose it would be. The investigation was now a race against time. Julian was a ghost, a highly intelligent and dangerous killer who had covered his tracks with scientific precision. Eli had to find concrete proof linking him to the poison and to the scene of the burial before he could spook and disappear. The focus shifted entirely to Julian's life. His expensive apartment, his finances, his digital footprint. Eli's team began the meticulous process of building a cage of evidence around him. They learned he had no official job as a freelance software developer. He had no clients, no registered business, no legitimate source for the river of cash flowing into his accounts. His entire life was a carefully constructed lie, just like the story he had fed them about his uncle. Eli felt a cold certainty settle over him. He was no longer just hunting a killer. He was hunting a chemist, a modern-day alchemist who had turned his gift for science into an instrument of death. Julian hadn't just killed his uncle, he had deconstructed him on a cellular level, an act of ultimate, intimate betrayal. The science was pointing to the killer, and all Eli had to do was follow the evidence to Julian's hidden lab. Julian Bishop lived his life behind a digital curtain. His public face, the smart, successful tech freelancer, was a fiction maintained by a LinkedIn profile and a sleek, professional-looking website that listed no actual clients. To find the real Julian, Eli knew they had to rip that curtain down. He got a warrant for Julian's apartment, his car, his phone, and, most importantly, his electronic devices. The raid was quiet and fast. They picked Julian up on his way to the gym, taking him completely by surprise. His confident swagger evaporated, replaced by a flicker of genuine fear before his cool, arrogant mask snapped back into place. While Julian was being transported to the station, Eli led the search of his downtown apartment. The place was minimalist and sterile, more like a hotel suite than a home. There were no personal photos, no books, no clutter. It was the home of a man with no attachments and many secrets. The tech setup, however, was state-of-the-art. A powerful custom-built PC and a network of servers hummed quietly in a closet. The forensics tech who specialized in cybercrime, a young genius named Simmons, got to work immediately. "He's good," Simmons muttered within minutes, his fingers flying across a keyboard. "Everything is behind layers of heavy encryption, military grade. This isn't your average user." While Simmons battled the encryption, the physical search continued. In a locked filing cabinet, they found chemistry textbooks and academic journals on toxicology. In a kitchen drawer, hidden beneath a false bottom, were several small, unlabeled vials of crystalline powder. It was a major find, but they still needed to connect the powders to the poison used on Walter. Hours passed. Julian sat in an interrogation room, coolly demanding a lawyer and refusing to say another word. Simmons, fueled by coffee and energy drinks, was making progress. He finally bypassed the first layer of security, gaining access to the main operating system. But the real data was on a series of external hard drives, each protected by its own unique and even more complex encryption key. "This guy isn't just protecting data," Simmons said, rubbing his tired eyes. "He's built a fortress. I need to take these back to the lab. This is going to take a while." As the team packed up the electronics, another officer called Eli over to the bedroom. Hidden in a vent was a small disposable burner phone. It was the kind of thing used by people who didn't want their calls traced. They had its last known location pinged. The signal led them not to an office or a lab, but to a nondescript self-storage facility on the industrial outskirts of the city. Eli felt a surge of victory. This was it. Armed with another warrant, they descended on the storage facility. The manager directed them to Unit 237, rented by Julian Bishop under a false name. After cutting the lock, they slid the metal door up. The unit didn't contain furniture or old boxes. It was a fully functional, clandestine chemical laboratory. The space was crammed with beakers, flasks, centrifuges, and sophisticated ventilation hoods. The air was thick with the sharp, sterile scent of solvents. On a stainless steel workbench lay printouts of complex molecular diagrams and order forms for precursor chemicals from international suppliers. It was a poisoner's workshop, a place where science was perverted for profit and murder. The crime scene unit began the painstaking task of cataloging every piece of equipment and every chemical compound. Back at the cybercrime lab, Simmons had a breakthrough. He'd managed to crack one of the external drives. What he found laid Julian's entire operation bare. He wasn't just a chemist. He was an entrepreneur of death. Using the anonymity of the dark web, Julian operated a digital storefront. He synthesized rare, often illegal, chemical compounds and untraceable toxins for a global client base. His customers were assassins, rogue states, and researchers operating outside the law. The drive contained meticulous records, formulas, transaction logs paid in cryptocurrency, and encrypted communications with clients. And then they found the file they were looking for. It was a research log, labeled simply Project WA. Inside were detailed notes, dated over a period of 3 months, documenting the synthesis and effects of a specific neurotoxin. He had been testing it, refining it, adjusting the dosage. He had used his own uncle as a human guinea pig, slowly poisoning him over weeks, observing the symptoms, headaches, fatigue, nausea, and logging them with chilling scientific detachment. The final entry, dated the night Walter disappeared, read, "Final dose administered, 25 milligauss. Expected outcome. Complete central nervous system collapse within 2 to 4 hours. Project complete." They had him. They had his lab, his chemicals, his murder weapon, and now, in his own words, a detailed confession. The digital ghost had been captured. The evidence was absolute, a cold, hard, and undeniable chain linking the arrogant nephew to the scientifically engineered death of the man who trusted him. Eli looked at the printout of Julian's research log, the detached language making the crime even more monstrous. He now had everything he needed to walk into that interrogation room and shatter Julian Bishop's world. The air in the interrogation room was stale and silent. Julian Bishop had been sitting there for hours, a picture of defiance, his lawyer by his side. He had refused to answer any questions, his expression a mixture of boredom and contempt. He believed he was untouchable, protected by his intellect and his layers of digital security. He had no idea that his entire secret world had been laid bare. Eli entered the room and sat down opposite him. He didn't speak at first, just placed a thick file folder on the metal table between them. He opened it and slowly, deliberately, began to lay out a series of large, glossy photographs, one by one. The first was of the clandestine lab in the storage unit. The second showed the vials of powder found in his apartment. The third was a printout of his dark web storefront. Julian's cool composure didn't waver, but Eli saw a new tension in his shoulders, a tightening around his eyes. "We found your workshop, Julian," Eli said, his voice calm and even. "Impressive setup. You're a talented chemist, a real gift." Julian's lawyer cleared his throat. "My client will not be answering any questions." Eli ignored him, his eyes locked on Julian. He slid the next photo across the table. It was a close-up of the research log from his hard drive, the title Project WA clearly visible. "Walter Avery," Eli said quietly. "That's what it stood for, right? You documented the whole thing, the dosage, the symptoms, the final fatal dose. It's all there, in your own words. You used your own uncle as a lab rat." For the first time, Julian's mask cracked. A flicker of pure, unadulterated rage flashed in his eyes before being replaced by his usual arrogance. But it was too late. Eli had seen it. "This is absurd," Julian scoffed, shaking his head. "That's fabricated evidence. You hacked my computer and planted that." "Did we plant the lab too?" Eli countered, leaning forward. "Did we plant the DNA on the shirt collar we found buried in the wall with his body?" "Your DNA, Julian. We matched it an hour ago." The lawyer put a hand on Julian's arm, but Julian shook it off. The illusion of control was shattering. The walls of his carefully constructed world were closing in. "My aunt did it," Julian blurted out, his voice suddenly sharp and venomous. "She was tired of him, of being poor. She begged me for help. She poisoned him for the insurance money. I just helped her move the body. I was protecting my family." It was a last desperate lie, an attempt to throw Denise under the bus one final time. Eli just shook his head slowly. "No, Julian. Denise has been in a catatonic state since we arrested her. But we know you forced her to take out that insurance policy. We know you've been bleeding them dry for months. The real question isn't whether you did it. We know you did. The question is, why did you tell us your aunt's story? Why did you lie to her and manipulate her?" Eli paused, letting the weight of the question settle in the room. He had one last piece of evidence, something he had been holding back. We also recovered the audio from your apartment's security system, Eli said, his voice dropping. It was a bluff, but a calculated one. The cloud backup, it recorded everything, including your conversations with Denise after you killed Walter. Julian's face went white. He looked at his lawyer, then back at Eli, his mind racing, trying to calculate the odds, to find an escape that no longer existed. The bluff had worked. He believed it. The final wall of his defense crumbled into dust. A strange calm settled over him. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a chilling emptiness. He leaned back in his chair, and a small, cold smile touched his lips. "He was a stupid, stubborn old man," Julian said, his voice devoid of emotion. "He found one of my shipments, a box of precursor chemicals. He didn't know what they were, but he knew they were illegal. He was going to ruin everything, my entire business, my life's work, all because of his pathetic working-class morality." He spoke with a chilling detachment, as if discussing a failed experiment. "He gave me a week to dismantle a multi-million-dollar international operation and turn myself in. He thought a prison sentence would build character. He was a relic." "So you killed him," Eli stated. "I eliminated a problem," Julian corrected him. "It was merciful, really, painless. He just went to sleep. The real problem was Denise. She panicked. She wanted to call the police." His expression soured with contempt. "She was weak. I had to control her. I told her the people I worked with were dangerous, that if she talked, they wouldn't just come for me. They would come for her. I told her they would burn her house down with her in it. I painted a picture for her. I made her so terrified of the imaginary monsters that she couldn't see the real one standing right in front of her." He recounted how he forced her to clean the house, to buy the bleach and the lime, how he mixed the mortar and built the tomb while she watched, paralyzed by fear, how he coached her on the Atlanta story, making her repeat it until it became her reality. "She was my alibi," he said with a shrug. "The grieving, confused wife. Who would ever suspect the loving nephew? It was perfect." The confession spilled out, cold and methodical. There was no remorse, no guilt, only the clinical pride of a scientist detailing his successful work. He had not only murdered his uncle, but had systematically destroyed his aunt's mind, twisting her love and fear into a weapon for his own protection. Eli listened, his own anger a cold, hard stone in his gut. He had seen evil in many forms, but this was different. This was the evil of intellect without empathy, of ambition without morality. It was the quiet, sterile, and absolute evil of a man who saw other human beings not as family, but as variables in an equation. And when the equation no longer balanced, he simply erased them. The trial of Julian Bishop was a formality. Faced with the mountain of irrefutable evidence, the lab, the financial records, the DNA, and his own chilling, detailed confession, his defense was hopeless. The jury was out for less than an hour. He was found guilty of first-degree murder, illegal manufacturing of a controlled substance, and witness tampering. The judge, calling his crimes an act of profound and calculated depravity, sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As he was led from the courtroom, Julian showed no emotion, his face the same arrogant, empty mask he had worn from the beginning. The prison gates would close on a brilliant mind that had become a vessel for pure evil. Denise Avery never faced a trial. After weeks of evaluation, she was declared mentally unfit, a victim of extreme psychological trauma and manipulation. Her mind, unable to process the horror of her husband's murder and her own role in its concealment, had retreated into a protective shell of delusion. Eli visited her once at the state psychiatric facility, a quiet place with manicured lawns that felt a world away from the grit of Baltimore. He found her sitting in a sunroom, staring out at a garden. She was calmer than he had ever seen her, but her eyes were still distant. "Mrs. Avery?" Eli said gently. She turned and looked at him, a flicker of recognition in her gaze. "Detective Porter," she said, her voice a soft whisper. They told me Walter isn't coming back. I'm sorry, Denise. Yes, that's true." Tears welled in her eyes, the first genuine emotion Eli had ever seen from her. They were tears of grief, but also of a terrible, dawning clarity. "I knew," she whispered, clutching her hands in her lap. "Deep down, I think I knew from the moment I saw him lying there. But, Julian, He said Walter would want me to be strong. He said we had to protect the family. He twisted everything up inside me until I didn't know what was real anymore. It was easier. It was easier to believe he was just sleeping. You were a victim too, Denise, Eli said. He used your fear and your love for Walter against you. I should have called for help, she said, her voice trembling. But I was so afraid. And Walter, he loved that boy so much. He was so proud of him. How could a boy he loved do something so monstrous? It was a question with no answer. Eli left her there, in the quiet sunroom, beginning the long, painful journey of piecing her shattered reality back together. The scars of Julian's manipulation would likely never fully heal. Weeks later, Eli stood on his own porch, looking out at the city as dust settled. The Avery case was closed, filed away in a cabinet with hundreds of others. Justice, in its cold, procedural way, had been served. But the case left a bitter aftertaste. It was a stark reminder of the insidious nature of systemic bias. If he had listened to the easy narrative, to his captain's initial push to focus solely on the wife with the insurance policy, Julian Bishop might have gotten away with it. Denise Avery, the primary victim of his cruelty, could have been wrongfully convicted. It was a sobering thought that the pursuit of justice is only as good as the willingness to look past the obvious, to challenge the comfortable stereotype. The true lesson of the silence on Monroe Avenue was not just about the evil one man could do, but about the terrifying power of manipulation. Julian's most potent weapon wasn't the poison he concocted in his lab. It was the fear he instilled in his aunt. He had weaponized her silence, turning her into both a shield and a prisoner. It was a profound violation, a destruction of the soul that was, in its own way, as final as the murder itself. The evil you're hunting isn't always the monster hiding in the shadows. Sometimes it's the one with a familiar face, a charming smile, and a brilliant mind. And the most dangerous silence is not the absence of noise, but the absence of truth, born from a fear so deep it swallows everything else whole.